I'm Alicia Mahill, the Exhibition Development Assistant at the Reach Gallery Museum. This video will highlight the history of Abbotsford's Punjabi community and its commitment to farming activism. This is one of many videos created for our South Asian in the Valley exhibition. In the 1970s, the majority of farm workers in the Fraser Valley were Punjabi immigrants who often worked in difficult circumstances. This included no washrooms in the fields, no running water in the cabins, and no daycare for their children. Pesticides were often used without proper protective equipment being provided. Farm workers were hired through a labor contracting system where middlemen contracted workers out to farms. This system cut into the farm workers' wages, often taking up as much as a third of their earnings. Combined with their exclusion from much of the provincial legislation protecting workers such as the Minimum Wage Act, this made the average farm worker's yearly earnings quite difficult to live on. Raj Chauhan was elected Speaker of the BC Legislature in 2020. He had been a student union activist in India. He, along with other leaders like Harinder Mahil, witnessed firsthand the farm workers' grievances and decided to form a union to push for their rights. In February of 1979, the Farm Workers Organizing Committee was formed. 2 years later, the FWOC transformed into a union. So, in April of 1980, the Canadian Farmworkers Union held its founding convention where Raj Chauhan was elected the CFU's first president. The CFU looked for inspiration south of the border, where Californian farm workers had unionized in the 1960s. Cesar Chavez, a leader of the Californian labor movement, often came to BC to speak to the CFU and served as an example of what farm workers' unions could achieve. The union's first major victory came when they organized a large-scale strike in July of 1979. Local farms had not been paying workers' wages. The CFU organized a protest at one such farm where the owner paid $80,000 on the spot after 2 hours of negotiations, thus demonstrating the impact successful union organization could have on the conditions of farm workers. This was one of many negotiations and protests organized by the CFU for better working conditions and equitable pay. An executive member of the CFU, Pratham Kaur, was a prominent face at many of the protests, often leading boliyan, Punjabi rhyming verses that are a form of oral storytelling to rally the protesters. This spirit of farming activism can be seen in Abbotsford's Punjabi community 40 years later with the protests that began in late 2020 in support of India's farmers. The ongoing protests in India were sparked by the introduction of 3 farm bills. Farmers are demanding the repeal of these laws as they fear that by enacting them, the Indian government is leaving them vulnerable to corporations. The first 2 bills would abolish the mandi system, which guarantees farmers a minimum support price set by the government. Without this, farmers fear large corporations could easily take advantage of them. The third bill makes it possible for corporations to hoard agricultural goods after purchasing them, giving them greater bargaining power over farmers. In Punjab specifically, it has become increasingly difficult to farm in recent decades, and so there is a fear that, with the passage of these bills, many farmers will become landless and sink deeper into debt. So the farmers began a movement called Delhi Chalo, where thousands of farmers have peacefully marched to Delhi to demand the repeal of these laws. While the main protest is occurring in and around Delhi, the Punjabi diaspora has been supporting their protests worldwide with protests of their own and by raising awareness on social media. In Abbotsford, there is a significant Punjabi population, many of whom come from a farming background. The community has organized ongoing protests and created social media platforms to raise awareness of farmers' rights. Many of these protests have been occurring at the intersection of South Fraser Way and Clearbrook Road, not far from where the 1979 protests took place. There is a large youth presence at these Abbotsford protests. Many are protesting to encourage their own government to speak out and support India's farmers and to raise awareness of humanitarian issues at stake, using social media to widely circulate the Indian government's treatment of the farmers. The many ways in which youth are engaging with this issue shows how the farmers' protests in India are of importance to many members of Abbotsford's community. I hope you enjoyed this video in support of our South Asian in the Valley exhibition. This is only a small part of the history of farming activism in Abbotsford. If you would like to share your stories, please contact info@thereach.ca.